Well then, as I just mentioned, this is kind of an informal and iterative project that we are excited to be doing our second presentation on today in partnership with Africatown. And to begin, I'll let you know a little bit about who we are. I am Caitlin Lombardi. I also have Shannon Keith, Natalie Lawrence, and Elizabeth Jarby here with me. We are four fairly random white women who know that we can do better and know that a lot of white people want to do better and need to really evolve from that kind of vague idea to personal, meaningful action. It's really well past time to start. So to begin, we share that we are speaking to you all from land that white colonizers stole from the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Coast Salish peoples. This is an area that belonged and belongs to 66 distinct tribes and was taken through violence and dishonesty. And particularly because we are talking about the redistribution of wealth, property, and land today, we really first acknowledge how we came to inhabit this particular land and the reality that the concept of ownership of this land was created by white people and used to commit genocide and destroy entire cultures. So heavy way to start, but very important always, and particularly in this conversation. We implore everyone here to pay their monthly rent to Real Rent Duwamish. Natalie, I think, is going to drop that link in the chat if you don't already. Indigenous Peoples Day is next Monday, and we hope that you'll be able to mark the day as someone who already pays their rent to the Duwamish, who have never been granted tribal status by the United States government, and so don't receive any of the resources and rights that are provided to other tribes to this day. Also, to begin, it goes without saying, everything that we bring to this conversation is learned from Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We think that we can advance the conversation among white people. And so that's what we're here to do today, and those who feel they've benefited from white privilege. We have three asks of you today. One is to make that monthly commitment to Real Rent Duwamish and to Africatown Community Land Trust. Two is to participate openly in a conversation about moving white wealth via the chat and breakout sessions. And three, to let us know what you think. Like I said, this is iterative and we really hope for your feedback. Also to begin, we really want each of you to recognize that each of you is here because you want to do something to address racial inequality. And we are sure that there are people here who have read many more books on anti-racism and Black history than we have, who follow incredible thought leaders, donate their time and money wisely and intentionally. We're going to go over some historical facts and share some ideas that our group has about how white people can move forward on many of our promises to do better. We hope you find it interesting and thought-provoking and would also really like to learn from you. We know that you're all coming from unique places and perspectives, and that will be important to this conversation. So to begin the meat of the presentation, we start with this statement of belief. We believe through whiteness, we have become untethered from our own humanity, disconnected from empathy, from history and from place, through centuries of justifying violence in the name of profit. Really want to kind of ground where we are going from this statement. And a few things that we are here to do and not to do. We are here to take responsibility for that humanity, to work toward being whole. This conversation has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with our collective humanity. To lay a little groundwork for that, I want to share our intentions around this gathering and to note upfront a few traps that we want to avoid as we think about what's possible. We also want to acknowledge and deeply appreciate that there are people from many different generations and unique backgrounds here who will have different experiences that inform how you show up, from the language that you use, to your comfort speaking on these topics, to your access to wealth. Hopefully there is a wide variety represented here, and we thank every single one of you for choosing to be part of this discussion. We will discuss some very deeply disturbing facts that many of you may know, maybe learned a long time ago, or just in the past year as a lot of white people kind of woke up to some of to reality. And Some of it maybe we've become a bit numb to, but we really have to force ourselves to look at it anew and ask you to try to take the presentation in as though it is all new and let the reality of it wash over you in defiance of that complacency. We're here to respond to repeated calls for action to protect Black lives. We're here to take reparative action to address the persisting damages of white supremacy in the United States. And some things that we are not here to do is question the reality and experiences of Black people, to ponder nuances and exceptions to the starkly worst outcomes that we will discuss for Black people in the United States today, or to delay action. So we won't be utilizing the existence of other injustices to defer action. We won't be saying, yeah, but, or what about, or think that we need more information to take action. We have more than enough information. So if you feel any of these things coming up for you, please see if we can move past them towards action. So in June 2020, there was supposedly a great awakening around the reality of racism and police violence in the United States. It's been a bit more than a year since the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd made headlines. With these tragedies, white Americans were given yet more indisputable, horrific evidence that white supremacy is alive and well and taking Black lives every day, including at the hands of our state agents who are sworn to protect and serve. We were horrified. We said we were going to do better. We posted on social media. So what have we done? Since the summer of 2020, 30 states have passed police reform laws. These laws mostly pertain to use of force, to an officer's duty to intervene and report misconduct, the banning of some lethal tactics such as no-knock warrants. All of these things are very, very important, however, unlikely to get at the root and remedy the racist culture and history of policing in the United States in a life-saving way. Federally, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act sits in the Senate more than a year after its introduction. Second, we put anti-racism books on the bestseller list. Sales of the top books on this topic increased by up to 6,800% in the months following in May, basically from May to August 2020. The top three of these were White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluo, and How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Very importantly, the absolute topmost of these bestsellers was White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, who is a white woman. And the book really is a 101 on the concept of white privilege and fragility for white people. So that far outsold the books by the two Black authors and experts on the same subject. Now we've also done some other things. Police continue to kill approximately 1,000 people each year. They have already killed 940 people in 2021. 1 out of 3 of these people are Black, despite Black people being 1 in 10 of the overall population. 361 bills to restrict voting rights, which target Black people specifically, were introduced this year. 30 of these have already been enacted, all of which were cleared for takeoff in 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. And certainly also the way was paved by the white supremacist politics that we've seen on the rise at the state level over the past years. 21 states have introduced legislation to ban critical race theory. 8 actually passed these laws, which when you read them, don't even use the term critical race theory. Mostly what they say is that they ban the discussion, training, and/or orientation that the United States is inherently racist, as well as any discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. Truly, that is what our states are outlining right now. And the parameters actually extend beyond race to include gender lectures and discussions as well. And lastly, just 18% of Americans and declining support the movement to defund police, which was the loudest, most clear request coming out of the protests of 2020 and ongoing protests today. And then I will let you all sort of sit and take in this slide, which is deeply upsetting. It shows the change in support for Black Lives Matter biracial group over the past year. You can see that all of the lines peak in June 2020, right at that promise of a reckoning, right? And then each decline over time, returning to just above where their initial support was, except for one, that kind of pinkish purple line that drops off the face of the earth there, ending about 10 points lower than where it started. This is why there's a lot of quotation marks going around the reckoning and the idea of the awakening, right? And frankly, most of us don't know Black people. Despite our supposed desire and possibly our own perception of reality, we live incredibly segregated lives in the United States. Schools today are more segregated than they were in the late 1960s. Predominantly white schools, of course, receive 23 billion more in funding compared with predominantly BIPOC school districts. Here in Washington, the whole population is only 3.7% Black. And in Seattle, our largest city, fewer than 7% of residents are Black. Even white people who would like to be allies likely don't interact with many Black people in an authentic way on a regular basis, which really begs two reality checks, in my opinion. First is that we cannot solve for the kind of injustices and inequities that we'll discuss today by sitting in our work meetings, waiting to catch a microaggression and speak up for a Black colleague. We need to do that too, of course, but it won't close the wealth gap. It won't empty our prisons, won't bring George Floyd back to life. I think it's incredibly important to admit and acknowledge this fact so that we can move past the belief that racism is something that we can solve by being better white people, reading the right books, or checking our own biases. These things, of course, are important on an individual level, but nowhere near enough. And the second thing this brings up, I think, is why on earth do we think that it would be impossible to pay reparations to just 3.7% of our state population, just 13.4% of the US population? It's indefensible that we're even having to have this conversation. But on that note, and before I pass it to the next presenter, I want to make it very, very clear that we need full, real, true reparations at the government level, which includes official recognition of harm and repairs outside of just financial resources. So this project that we're talking about tonight does not in any way claim to fill that need, and we must all be supporting the Black-led organizations that advance reparations policy. A great place to start is the Movement for Black Lives Reparations Toolkit, which has incredible information and resources, and also links to other groups that you can support towards that effort. What we are advocating for here is that white people start paying now, today, in addition to that advocacy. And with that, I will pass it to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Caitlin. So what are Black thought leaders saying now? Here we'll share just a tiny sampling of what a few smart people have on their minds in the aftermath of 2020. Frederick Joseph. There is no greater gaslighting than the people who invented race as a construct to oppress others within every single system that exists, telling those oppressed people that they are, quote unquote, making everything about race. Monique Melton. Around this time last year, we witnessed the collective, quote unquote, pseudo-white awakening, but you didn't keep your promises, and we also knew you wouldn't. Shay Stewart Boulay. I must confess that I am tired of watching white folks reflect on their white privilege. No one ever seems to move into radical action. Folks want to be comfortable, middle-class armchair activists. That's not how this works. And I'm going to pause here to highlight that this is a major reason why we specifically invited white people to this conversation. People of color are absolutely welcome, and thank you to any of you who are here. You are more than welcome to be here, to know what we're saying, to give us feedback and contribute or not contribute at all. but people of color should not have to watch us white people educate ourselves and be rallied into action when we have been given many, many opportunities already. So this is our work to do. And lastly, Zeli Imani. We didn't ask for a Juneteenth to be observed as a national holiday. We wanted an end to police violence. So before moving on to the next slide, I wanted to give folks a chance to take note of these leaders and jot down their names for their accounts to follow. You can take a screenshot. Natalie also put it in the chat, I think. They have incredible resources for white people trying to be anti-racist, and you can support them financially through Patreon and taking their courses and purchasing their books and other works. And with that, we believe we cannot go another day without taking action to repair the deadly anti-Blackness that defines the United States past and present, and ultimately the anti-Blackness violence throughout the rest of the world. So for this next portion of the presentation, I'm going to be taking us through a few parts of our history that are deeply disturbing, as mentioned. I want to give us a chance to take a deep breath and thank you again for being here and sitting with this. So first, to broadly summarize, present conditions were created by white people through structural and systematic racial terror, beginning with genocide and slavery. We're often taught about slavery as being this terrible thing that happened to Black people, but something as organized and long-lasting as slavery doesn't just happen. White people invented race to excuse and inspire horrific deeds in the name of profit. Beginning with the slaughtering and scalping of Indigenous women, children, men, and Two-Spirit peoples, cutting off parts of their human flesh and wearing it in pride, to piling African people in slave ships, throwing babies into the waters that pregnant African women birthed at sea, to 250 years of torturing enslaved Black people, often beating them to death for show, using sexual violence as both a pastime and a tool of control, selling off children as young as 2 and starving new babies to death while forcing their mothers to breastfeed the infants of white enslavers. It feels almost too hideous to speak this part of our history out loud, these acts that our ancestors committed, and yet it was completely regular, legal, protected behavior for white people in the United States for much, much longer than it has not been. And I recently saw a thread on Twitter that started with, quote unquote, slavery was at least 100 times worse than what you were told about. And in this one thread, I learned more about the true horrors of American slavery than in my entire education, which is just one example of how successfully white supremacy has worked endlessly to cover up this part of us and in order just to protect our feelings. So there will never be an economic way to absolve the acts of slavery. That's certain. But the economic facts remain, and I am going to repeat a few statistics here so that it doesn't go over our heads and we remain present. Human lives and bodies were commodified and used to build wealth. More than 12 million human beings were kidnapped, sold, bred, and enslaved in the Western Hemisphere. As pictured on this slide, they could be inventoried, the dollar value of their lives written down on a piece of paper, some here as young as 4 years old. Banks like JP Morgan, Chase, and creditors accepted enslaved people as quote unquote collateral for loans and were authorized to repossess them if the loan defaulted. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life Insurance also profited from policies sold to insure enslaved people as property, and these companies are still living today and their profits growing. Through 250 years of chattel slavery, white people stole what can only be estimated as quadrillions. That's quadrillions of money in labor. In 1830, 1 million enslaved Black people generated half of the US global exports, picking cotton. And what most of us are familiar with, at the end of the Civil War, 4 million freed Black people were each promised 40 acres and a mule. And then Andrew Johnson went back on his promise, taking the land that would have been worth $3.1 trillion. That's $3.1 trillion today. And by design, most of it was given back to former enslavers as reparations for their lost property. Go to the next slide. Timeline here shows after Black people have never been allowed to just be anywhere, have anything. For example, the GI Bill, which helped World War II veterans secure land and wealth, gave them a year of unemployment payments, education expenses, living stipends, guaranteed loans for houses, farms, land. In contrast, was structured to prevent 1.2 million Black veterans, not to mention having served in segregated ranks, prevented them from its benefits. You can also see how long white enslavers thrived compared to the US population alive today in that upper right corner. Many who believe that no impacts of slavery remain, but we know that to be differently, which leads me into the economics of Blackness in 2020. In unemployment, Black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed as white Americans. In income, Black Americans earned 59 cents for every dollar earned by white Americans, averaging 29 grand less per year. In home ownership, 42% of Black families own their home, while 73% of white families own their home. In maternal health, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or due to pregnancy-related causes. For incarceration, Black Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, prevented from accumulating wealth. And for generational wealth, Black Americans are 16 times more likely to be in the 3rd generation of poverty, defined as having less than $48K a year for a family of 4 in today's money. Overall, the median white family has 10 times more wealth than the median Black family. So, yeah, before we dive into what can be done, Natalie, what hasn't been working?
Capitalism has not been working. So I want to take this moment to discuss the financial system we all exist in and explain a little bit more about why we believe it will not solve the wealth gap. So an economy that became the greatest in the world by stealing the lives and labor of millions of African and Black people will never freely correct the key feature that made it so. A racial hierarchy that places Black people at the very bottom and erases Indigenous people entirely. So in this presentation already, we've spoke a lot about land and wealth accumulation, and 2 of capitalism's most defining traits are the ability to accumulate wealth and pass it on, and the ability to have private land ownership. So I think a lot of proponents of capitalism, at least proponents of capitalism that I've talked to, will often say that it puts everyone on an even playing field and that you get what you put in and that you'll get your piece of the pie soon enough. But if private property and accumulated wealth can be passed down through families over generations and generations, and if Black people were not legally allowed to own land in certain parts of this country during that period, those periods of time, white people have essentially been hoarding their slices of the pie and multiple other pies in their freezer and saving them for a rainy day. By upholding this economic system, we have perpetually barred people from actually getting some of that pie that we claim is so readily available to people who work hard enough. And in this country, 60% of stolen land is privately owned by either individuals or corporations. And the wealthiest 1% of households own 40% of the nation's non-home real estate. With capitalism, we'll always be exploiting a working class, and the people suffer most are workers of color. There can be no profit without exploitation. Capitalism will always prioritize profit over literally everything else, including the health of our environment, the health of humanity, and it will keep power in the minority capitalist class and leave poor people at the bottom for future generations. And to sum up my rant on capitalism, I want to just present a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967, which I see as one that is conveniently kind of forgotten about when we celebrate MLK Day and post our favorite quotes on social media. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. Philanthropy has also been very problematic. And while we acknowledge, of course, that there has been good in philanthropy and good in the world of nonprofits, I think it's also important to remember that when white people control so much wealth, it's inevitable that philanthropy will also fail the communities that it claims to serve. So despite all the rhetoric around social justice and race equity in the philanthropic world, especially within this last year, white community foundations so Bridgespan did a really interesting study of 25 cities, and these were cities that had large Black populations, and they found that community foundations in these cities spent $78 per person overall, but only spent $6 per Black person. And 7 of the richest grant-making foundations own about $100 billion in assets, and approximately only 1% of foundation funding is specifically for Black communities. And I think a big part of this connects back to what Caitlin brought us to speed on earlier about living in really segregated lives. I think, as we all know, how important networking is in the working world and in philanthropy to raise money. I think it becomes a lot of white people passing money back and forth to different white people's organizations because they're more connected because we do live in those segregated lives. So philanthropy in its most current state will not be the solution for reparative action in this country. Our government has also failed us and everyone. So our government is not, the idea of reparations is not new to the US government. We have paid kind of woefully insufficient reparations before. After the internment of Japanese people post-World War II, we paid $1.6 billion. And the government has paid $1.3 billion to Native Americans for a fraction of stolen land, but never has the US government paid reparations to Black people. I'm sure many of us are aware of HR 40. This is a bill that would create a federal commission to study, just to study, the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery. And it was first introduced in 1989, so it was 32 years ago, and was only finally approved by the Judiciary Committee in January of 2019. So 32 years to almost get to the point of studying potential reparations. This isn't even something that would guarantee reparative action, but would just study it. So it's beyond too slow. And there has been a coalition of US. Still a couple seconds here. So the mayors had no detail on how much it would cost, who would pay for it, or how people would be chosen. All of the details are meant to be worked out by the help of local commissions comprised of representatives from Black-led organizations set up to advise the mayor of each city. But the mayors say they're committed to paying reparations instead of just talking about them. And one of these mayors of St. Louis, Missouri, she was the first female Black mayor, Toshwara Jones, said Black Americans don't need another study that sits on a shelf. We need decisive action to address the racial wealth gap holding communities back across our country. Go ahead, Caitlin. Thanks. So resources must move now. So even with these efforts, Black people are dying today in assisted health, to buy safety, to buy autonomy, and to buy your future. We will not solve any of the inequities we discussed unless and until we move massive amounts of unrestricted money into Black bank accounts. If we are at a loss for stopping police killings, this is a critical aspect of that. If we are at a loss for fixing the wealth gap, this is a no-brainer. And if we really think Black Lives Matter, we have to put our money where our mouths are. Not only are reparations simply owed, they are a necessary foundation for any progress we claim to want toward racial equity. And with that, I will pass it back to Caitlin.
Thank you. I hope that I don't cut out again. If I do, feel free to start presenting any of the other co-hosts. So we believe white people who support the idea of reparations can take reparative action now. Which brings us to the idea of the Civil Reparations Project, which is we will de-hoard white wealth through significant and sustained investments in Black wealth now, without waiting for the political will required to implement full reparations. And we have come up with kind of 7 elements of what these reparative investments should feel like and should do. So number 1, no more donations. We cannot think of these debt payments as donations anymore. We have to remove the desire to be thanked, acknowledged, given a tax receipt or a quarterly progress report. Making reparative investments in a future that looks wildly different from the present is to our shared benefit. We must contribute the most that we can as the least that we can do. Number 2 is to commit to structural redistribution. Structural permanent redistribution. We have to build these investments into our regular finances the way we do many other expenses. And at the risk of kind of cheapening what this is by this analogy, it really is like another debt. Your car payment, mortgage, student loans. If you're like me, your student loans are a great example of a debt that you expect to simply pay every month for the rest of your life, even though it might stretch your finances considerably. We need to pay what we can all of the time, not once a year, not as a gift, but as a line item in our monthly budgets. Number 3, investigate and acknowledge our own wealth. Now, I am not talking about tracing our roots back to a particular enslaving family. The wealth made from slavery has long ago trickled into every aspect of our economy. As mentioned earlier, was the seed money for a number of existing corporations today. So I'm talking about confronting how much money we really have and what role we are playing in the economy. We probably have an income that's easy to calculate, but what other wealth do we have? Do we own a home? Do we have college funds for our kids? Do we have family that we can borrow money from? Do we qualify for a bank loan? The ability to go into debt is absolutely an indicator of access to wealth. Could you walk into a bank today and get a loan? What kind of safety nets do we have? Number 4 is to reimagine what financial success is. What does that look like to you? Is it having enough to retire, owning your home, taking an annual vacation? Does your financial success involve leaving the wealth gap exactly as it is today? Because it either does or it doesn't. There is no neutral. And what if saving the most money we can for ourselves and our families were not a more worthy personal goal? And I do mean that, a personal goal, than making reparative investments so that our children do not inherit an even worse wealth gap than what we have created. with even less of a chance at shrinking it? What if Black liberation were attached to each of our personal financial goals? Number 5 is to recalculate what is possible. When you remove yourself from what can I give right now thinking to how will I pay into this investment over time, the equation can start to change. We know that we do it all the time for other types of saving and spending. Financial advisors may have said it to you in the past. Our group has some suggestions on the how much of this project, and it will be the main topic we hope you'll discuss with one another in the breakout sessions. We really want to learn from you truly what's possible. And number 6 is to start today before dinner. Start by focusing on your own ability to move money. Start with organizations where Black people are already doing the long, hard, unending work of repair. Start where you are with Black-led organizations and mutual aid networks in your proximity. I say proximity, I'm not going to say community because I think it is a word that's being overused and undervalued right now by certain people. And as we've discussed on the slide about our segregated lives, you may not be in true community with Black people and you can still pay. Today, we're going to start with Africatown, which we'll hear more about in a moment. And we hope that the structure of this project will be something repeatable in other geographic areas. Number 7, it is not our money. It's just not our money. We're enjoying the derivatives of whiteness. We need to let go of the idea that we get to choose which Black people are worthy of receiving it, or that only those in severe need should receive it, or that we're owed receipts or reports or rewards. That's not how debt works. Black people are owed reparations, and we need to keep our focus on moving money out of white bank accounts. And with that, I will pass it over to Shannon.
Thanks, Caitlin. So most of you are here in part, at least, because you have previously supported Africatown Community Land Trust. And you may know they acquire, steward, and develop land assets that are necessary for the Black and African diaspora community to grow and thrive in place in the Central District. One thing that I learned recently is, the Central District, which you may know, was formed in part due to racist redlining policies, went in the last 50 years from 73% Black population to 18% Black population. So the work that Africatown Community Land Trust is doing there could not be more important. They've to date built 115 affordable housing units and have 126 more in the works at a second location. They've also secured over $1 million for Black contractors and are building $300,000 or less homes for historic Central District residents. And most recently, they have a youth achievement center in the works that will house and serve over 100 young people. So if you're not already a fan of them, I hope you continue to follow and learn more from them. And this is the organization that we're very excited to be paying our reparations to today. So how much? That is a big question, and we want to, as I said, talk about this in our breakout sessions today. But to start, we know that wealth is much more complicated than income, but for the purposes of a simple guideline, we put together a progressive percentage structure based on your income that we hope serves as a guideline for you to think about what is a meaningful amount. And given that there tends to be some secrecy and shame around discussions of wealth, the 4 of us are going to share some personal information about our own wealth and our commitment to reparations to the Africatown Community Land Trust. And I'll start. So I don't think I introduced myself, but I'm Shannon. I want to start my story of my wealth with my childhood, really, because my parents' wealth was able to support me through school and enabled me to graduate from school debt-free, which enabled me to get a job, which I now have with a coffee startup, making around $70,000 a year. I also was able to purchase my first home this past year in a gentrifying neighborhood. And so the actions I take, the actions I've already taken to contribute to systemic racism through my home ownership inspires my payment of $2,100 projected annually. So that works out to $175 monthly because it will be an ongoing payment to Africatown Community Land Trust. And I want to pass back to Caitlin to share.
Thanks. So my situation is I have been one of many layoffs over the last 18 months due to the pandemic, but previously worked in nonprofits and social impact, and most recently was making about $100,000 a year. Since July of last year, I've been on unemployment, but because I had been receiving a fairly high salary before that, I get about $58,000 a year from that unemployment, and have also been living very frugally over the last 18 months for lots of reasons. I have 3 kids and I rent my home, and I do have a partner who I was previously the breadwinner for the family, but who has stepped into that role over the last year and works in restaurants and has been making, it's hard to calculate with how much tips come into play and what a weird year it's been for restaurants, but I think we'll make around 60,000 this year. So if I base my calculation on our proposed chart, it would be about $145 a month, but because of the safety net I feel I have with family and how frugally we have been living, I'm going to commit to $250 a month for the year, which will be $3,000. And I will hand it over to Elizabeth.
Yes, so my wealth through whiteness has allowed my partner and I to buy a home in West Seattle, allowed our parents to retire and then support with childcare, which frees the way for both my partner and I to work part-time jobs. And both of our educations were paid for. We don't really spend time worrying about afterlife care. That's just to name a few. But our combined annual income is about 88 grand, and we will be investing 10% of our combined income on an annual basis towards collective liberation, and 3,000 of that 10% will be invested into Africatown specifically annually. And I'll pass it to Natalie.
Yeah, so I make around $65,000 per year. I work in nonprofits, and that's where I've spent most of my time in my career so far. The way I sort of calculated my investment was thinking of union dues, because your union dues are around 1.5%, and you pay into your union because it makes your workforce stronger and creates a better environment for you to live in. And that's exactly what I see investing in collective liberation as too, that it'll make all of my life and all of the lives better of every human. So for me, that 1.5% seems almost like a no-brainer to invest that amount. And so I went a little bit above that. I'm annually investing $2,400 into Africatown Land Trust in the form of monthly investments. And I also was able to graduate school debt-free, and due to inherited wealth from my family and my partner's family, we're also able to buy a home in South Seattle in a gentrifying neighborhood as well, which kind of continues to inspire a desire to make investments in reparative action.
Thanks all. So now it's time to break out and have these conversations amongst yourselves. As a reminder, this breakout time will not be recorded, so please be as vulnerable as you feel comfortable. We're going to be asking you to discuss what is your wealth, which includes income, home ownership, assets, future inheritance, safety net, ability to borrow, and other things that aren't listed here. And what would a sustained, significant structural investment in Black liberation look like for you? Can you meet or exceed the proposed amount? How much can you pledge monthly? So you should now be seeing an invite to go into your breakout rooms We might take a couple minutes off the 10 minutes, call you back maybe in 8, but please go ahead and discuss. And one tip from last time I liked, it might be a little awkward to start. So if you go by alphabetical first name, if that helps to share. And I just want to kind of open question, ask anyone to share, on video or in the chat, how the discussions went, any takeaways or interesting things that came up for you guys.
A lot of us agreed that the chart and kind of the sort of structured, like tiered way of thinking about how to visualize your commitment to be really helpful. I was saying that I get really anxious about money and don't know like what's enough, what's too much, especially for these kind of like getting to causes or things that I believe in, and definitely am guilty of thinking of it as just mine, and like, what if I need this? What if this happens? Some, medical thing or something like that, when to the earlier point, like this is really wasn't necessarily mine to begin with.
Yeah.
I was saying a lot of my wealth kind of came from a life insurance from the passing of my parents, which is, so that kind of underscores the like, oh, well, this bad thing happened to me, so I get this, but that's not the future that I want to be a part of moving forward. So anyways.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll share. My name's Julia. I use she, her pronouns. I can relate to what Clara said a lot. I found myself getting defensive about why I deserve to have the things I have. Even when I was talking through it, I was like, well, I have it because of X, Y, Z. And now I'm reflecting and I'm like, what was coming up for me that made me feel like I need to hoard this and protect this and defend it. So it was good to talk about it and to actually go through that thought exercise and think through it.
Absolutely.
I can feel, or I'm noticing that I'm saying like the intellectual things I want to say, but they don't necessarily match my feelings all the time. This definitely triggers my white scarcity story. And so I have to constantly be checking that like, there's really no scarcity. There's really no scarcity, that's just a myth and that it's okay.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to what Julia was saying before, but like talking through it and kind of outlining, okay, these are the things that define my wealth. And just like a really specific example, I was kind of talking through it, and it's like, I don't have a car payment because I have a generational wealth advantage of my parents and my family just giving me a car. And that's not something I have, a debt I have to worry about. And that's purely a reflection, a very literal example of my privilege. And so just saying that out loud and realizing that, and then realizing, okay, yes, of course, like this investment and redistribution of wealth is completely doable. So.
Yeah, and thanks, Catherine, for adding in the chat, helpful to hear others' honesty.
And I don't think we mentioned this in the presentation, but I feel like that was a huge part of how this sort of idea or project came to be, was that people are so cagey when they talk about wealth, and we've been kind of conditioned and trained to not speak about wealth, and would recommend, if you kind of haven't had open conversations with your families and with your friends about what wealth exists within those networks, to try it. My girlfriends, Lizzie and Shannon, were kind of part of this group. We all shared our salaries once, and it was incredibly enlightening just to share our role in salary. And I think it's important that we start destigmatizing sharing about wealth, because like Caitlin said, it's not our money.
Great. Well, I don't want to go too much over, so I'll talk about the next steps, and feel free to continue to add thoughts in the chat or email us after. That actually is a is the next step. Number 3, I'll jump ahead. Please provide us feedback on this presentation or your discussions or just anything you want to get off your mind at info@civilreparationsproject.com. And but more importantly, what I'm asking you to do right now is make an investment to reimagine Black Seattle with Africatown, which is their fundraising campaign. The link is right there. We'll also send a follow-up email with the link, but literally right now, you don't need to take more time. Just hop over to that webpage right now and start with an ongoing way, hopefully. Number 1. Number 2, please pay your rent to realduwamish.org, realrentduwamish.org. 3, give us any feedback. And lastly, stay tuned for the launch of the Civil Reparations Project pledge and the landing page that can be shared with others. All of these resources will be in a follow-up email, as will the presentation and the recording of it, in case there's anything you want to go back to or anything you want to share with someone else. Thanks so much for being here. And again, we really, really hope you take the opportunity right this moment to head over to the Africatown page and make your reparation payment. Thanks all for being here.
Thank you.